In 1995, Keanu Reeves starred in a dystopian science fiction film all about virtual reality. And you may be thinking The Matrix, but that came later. The first VR film for Reeves was actually Johnny Mnemonic, a film that ended up being a box office flop and is subjectively pretty terrible. But there's one scene that I have always absolutely loved. In order to hack into a database, Johnny dons a full VR rig to navigate through cyberspace, breaking through security and even threatening to crash another user.
I could crash you from here, man.
And I love this scene so much because it's one of the first ever 3D representations of what a virtual reality user interface could possibly look like. Gloves, a headset, gestures, typing. This film shows just how wild the possibilities are. And now, 30 years later, almost none of this is science fiction. We have the internet, gloves, hand tracking, VR headsets, but the user interfaces of these devices still look like this. And to this day, these interfaces are universally the most criticized elements of modern virtual reality. And so I decided to embark on a journey to explore the wild world of VR interfaces. Why are they designed the way they are? Why do they not look like this? Why are they so frustrating? And what can we do better? But in order to talk about VR design this deeply, you need to see the world from the perspective of a designer. And so that's where we're going to start, with the philosophical foundations of design. You don't need a degree to understand design, you just need that perspective shift and a few key terms.
Part 1. Foundations of Design.
50 years ago, Don Norman released two books that have practically become known as the Bible of Design: The Design of Everyday Things and Emotional Design. And while they talk of many things, the core messages can be shrunk down into a few main principles with a golden rule. And the first of those concepts is probably the most popular one. Good design is invisible. Try and think of the last time you had a great user interface or design experience. Now, try and think of all the times you've had a bad experience. It's much easier to point out when something feels wrong or bad than it is to pinpoint why something feels good. And I think we're all familiar with the bad examples. From accidentally suggestive signs to washing machines needing a key chart to operate. The worst one for me are doors. I am notoriously terrible with doors of all types. And I can list bad examples all day long, but I know I can't do the same with good examples. And that's the bittersweet nature of good design. It's invisible. The next set of concepts may sound a little more complicated, but it's actually really simple when you break it down. There are basically three all-encompassing principles that design abides by. It's a way to deconstruct why things don't work and to construct things that do. First up are affordances. An affordance is the sum of all possible interactions that a human can have with an object. The affordance of a door, for example, is the mechanical ability to swing 180 degrees. A door is afforded opening and closing. But how do you know which way the door swings? Is it a push or pull or sliding door? And this is where the second principle comes in: signifiers. A signifier communicates to people how they can interact with the affordances. A flat panel on a door signifies it's a push door. And in VR, for example, an object that is interactable may glow or highlight when you hover over it. That object's affordance is that it can be moved and interacted with. The signifier is the glow letting you know. And the final of these principles is feedback, the return of information to the user. A haptic buzz when you select something, a button's color changing, the click of a key press on a keyboard. And when all of these things come together, you're able to systematically figure out how a person can interact with an object, when, where, and in which way that interaction can happen, and of course, a way to let people know that this interaction did happen. And I know this may all seem extremely obvious, but there's a reason why these basic principles are taught the way they are. Now, when things work or don't work as intended, it's easier to single out exactly why. Like a coffee mug with a hole too small to put your fingers into, or a game asking you to press a lettered button that you can't see. Both are examples of bad or missing affordances. And this practice of applying these concepts not only leads to better designs, but can also literally save lives and prevent catastrophe.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare.
In 1979, the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant shut down after a partial meltdown. After the investigation, it was discovered that a single bad signifier almost led to complete nuclear disaster. On one of the control panels, a light was used to show whether a valve was open or closed. If the valve is open, the light is off. And once a button is pressed, the light goes on and the valve closes. The problem occurred when an operator pressed the button to close the valve as they do every day. The light switched on as it should, but the valve itself was actually stuck open. The light was signifying not whether the valve was actually open or closed like you'd expect, but instead the light reacted only to the button press itself, having no connection to the valve that the button controls. Disaster could have been averted by simply signifying the right affordances and giving the right feedback.
Part 2. The design of today's things.
I find it pretty spectacular that you could travel back in time 17 years, buy an iPhone, and you'll be greeted with almost the exact same interface you are today. And if you were to travel 40 years in time, you could grab a Macintosh off a store shelf and be met with the same exact affordances, signifiers, and feedback that we have today. Files, folders, windows, and a desktop. These are all skeuomorphic symbols, which is another very important term for VR. Skeuomorphism is the practice of using digital design elements that mimic a physical object. The computer isn't actually full of folders, and your smartphone doesn't need to make a shutter noise. But these are all good design practices that take something complex or unfamiliar and uses symbols and signifiers to break down their affordances into something recognizable and intuitive. They're all essentially just analogies, connections that enable your brain to build what's called a conceptual model, which I think is one of the coolest things that the human brain does automatically. You see a thing, and without any direction, you can intuitively make a model in your mind of how something works, or at least should work. As a simple example, you don't need an instruction manual to operate a pair of scissors. There's only one place for your fingers, and it's not the pointy end. And it's designed to do one thing. A pair of scissors is a tool that cuts. But what is a pair of scissors in a piece of software? There are no handles or cutting edges, but it's still a tool that cuts. And as human culture evolves, we design ever more complex things to be intuitive by relating them to things of the past. Shutter sounds, desktops, documents, folders, trash bins, scissors. And when you look at it, the last 50 years of design and user interfaces are really built upon centuries of physical things that we can all relate to without thinking. And that leads me to a really big question. Why have these interfaces stuck around for half a century? Why are we held back by physical constructs in the digital world? Why don't we have Johnny Mnemonic-style cyberspace exploration? Is it a lack of innovation? Is it just because this is what everyone's used to and no one dare change the formula? Or is it the inverse? Perhaps these technologies, smartphones, home PCs, the internet, have only proliferated as far into the human condition as they have because of the interfaces, because of good design. I mean, computers existed before the GUI, smartphones and feature phones and PDAs existed before the iPhone, but the explosion point, the moment where everything accelerated, smartphone wars, cheaper devices, and worldwide adoption, didn't happen until a design good enough allowed humans to interface with technology in a way that makes sense. And I'd argue that the answer to that big question is 100% because it's just what everyone's used to, but it's also 100% because of incredible design that we have ever been able to become used to it at all.
Part 3. The VR Design Paradox.
There have certainly been some interesting shakeups and ideas thrown out recently, especially with artificial intelligence and things like the humane AI pin, but they're as far away from being viable today as VR was in 2012. The technology is interesting, but the human interface has a long way to go. A story that may sound very familiar to VR itself. Virtual reality is an inherently interesting technology that I don't think we've figured out how to interface with yet. And Johnny Mnemonic is such an interesting case point because it displays the concept that anything is possible in this medium. You can do anything from floating panels to skeuomorphic spatial trash bins to delete files to navigating the internet like you're flying through Res. But that's almost overwhelming. And I think that's VR's first big design problem. VR itself is difficult to describe. It's hard to put it into words. And we've all heard the terms before. There's unlimited possibilities. You can be anywhere, anyone, do anything, infinite creativity. But infinity is an impossible concept to grasp. We're incapable of it as humans. And so instead, we resort to the hypothetical experience with the cliche, imagine you're on a beach watching the sunset, and within a blink, you're on the edge of a black hole in your virtual office, but you're actually there. That's what VR is. But then you actually get a headset and get into VR, and you quickly realize that it's nothing like that. The promises of VR are so tall, essentially godhood of your own personal reality, but that's not the reality. And the marketing doesn't reflect that. And if that's what you were expecting, you better have a really great imagination, or you're sorely and deeply disappointed, maybe even lied to. And so instead of thinking about VR in the impossibility of infinite places, let's think for a moment about virtual reality strictly from a design perspective. In the physical world, design is extremely limited to mechanical affordances. A door can only open in the way a door was mechanically designed to do so. But the physical world is also heavily contextualized through signifiers and detail. A sign can be read at a glance. Details can be immediately interpreted because we have a very solid conceptual model of reality and physics. We know from a very young age how the world works, even if we don't know the math behind it, which is also why computers and smartphones base everything on pseudomorphic symbols and analogies. We don't think like a computer, we think like humans, and humans live in reality alongside these devices. And those devices have their own physical constraints. An iPhone is afforded touch on the entire screen. There is no difference in functionality between these pixels and those pixels. Virtual reality, on the other hand, is legitimately fundamentally different from everything else. There is no mechanical constraint at all. There are no defined laws of physics. Affordance is an unlimited resource. Anything, anywhere can be used for any purpose. But the use of signifiers are deeply impacted. Signs are hard to read. Detail is limited to rendering power. And the biggest drawback is that the conceptual models we built from existing in physical reality and interacting with modern technology are prone to failure. From a philosophical point of view, everything within virtual reality is just a skeuomorphism of a different concept. A door in VR is not a physical door, obviously. It's a symbol of a passageway between one place to another. A button is not a button, and a pair of scissors is not a pair of scissors, but instead it's a tool that cuts. VR design at its core is the art of connection and analogy, using symbols and representation to do things that are not physically possible. And you may think, this is just game design. How is VR design any different? Well, even in the most immersive of flat first-person game design, you are always just an outside observer. In virtual reality, you're instead an inhabitant, which is its own double-edged sword. I think one of the most frustrating and confusing parts is when a skeuomorphic object that we have a conceptual model for in the physical world doesn't line up with the virtual one. And we're left with the same frustrating problems that we deal with in the physical world, but now in the virtual. I can't open the damn door. And I think the core real problem here is that modern VR interfaces make people feel stupid. It's frustrating. And even after tens of thousands of hours in VR, I have to constantly ask myself, is this bad or am I just bad? But this paradox of skill issue places us on the singular golden rule of design, the rule that trumps all others. You can throw out affordances, signifiers, feedback, conceptual models. They're all just abstractions to help guide a design to follow the golden rule. And it's that it is never the human's fault. We automatically blame ourselves for bad design. It's our nature. It has to be us. And while feeling stupid, we form a negative relationship with that design. We intuitively resist it because it makes us feel bad. And the golden rule exists to remind designers that the purpose of design is to build things that communicate with humans. Good design is good communication. And it makes me think of all the people that have walked away from a VR experience, definitely feeling a variety of emotions, some of it awe and wonder, but I guarantee that every single one of those experiences is also filled with quite a few negative emotions. And as we talked about earlier, the negatives weigh twice as much as the positive. So, what can we do about all this?
Part 4. The perfect VR operating system.
If there's one lesson Don Norman and my mother instilled in me, it's to never complain about something unless I have an alternative. And in this case, I do. I figured the best way to put all of this into practice is to conceptualize my dream interface. One that takes what we have today, shaves off as many frustrating pain points as possible, and allows people to enjoy VR because they're not thinking about VR. They're just doing it. I have 5 core VR operating system philosophies, or principles that I think every OS should go by. And the first is a virtual operating system should respect the user's space, both virtual and physical. It should serve as an anchor or a bridge between worlds, but never as something that gets in the way or takes attention without permission. The base core functions of any operating system should be a wristwatch or a hand menu that is always easily glanceable with basic information, but is never obtrusive unless there's intent. I can check the time, reply to a message, change quick settings, all without leaving the application that I'm in. And I actually find it especially disrespectful how Meta treats panels in VR. They stick to your face, obscure real-world objects. I mean, I can't even see the table I'm marking in mixed reality because a panel follows me like a stalker everywhere I go. It's a nightmare to imagine ad pop-ups in VR or panels that you can't get away from. So, rule 1, respect people's space. 2, all core OS and menu level systems should be designed for hand tracking first and controllers second. This may sound controversial, but hand tracking, when implemented well, can be significantly simpler than controller navigation. The first instinct when designing a UI for a controller is to hide functions behind buttons, and in VR you can't even see those buttons. With a hands-first design philosophy, you don't have the option to hide functions behind buttons. And on top of that, it is way easier to add controller support to a hand-focused design than it is to ever add hand tracking support with gestures mapped to 12 different buttons. And if there's one thing that the Vision Pro taught me, it's that I do not want to use controllers unless I have to. In those cases, such as games, well, grab the controllers and get to slicing. But for every moment up until that, I don't want to have to hold things in my hands. 3, standardization. The first 15 to 20 minutes of every single VR game is the exact same. You hop into the game and are immediately bombarded with the 20 questions of VR. Smooth turn or snap turn, teleport or smooth locomotion, vignette or no vignette. Now, almost every VR user I've ever met already knows their preferences, and this is generally the same among most VR games. So, why isn't this figured out when you first set up your headset in the initial setup, and then just set as a global standard for every game? Imposing this standard on developers not only increases people's comfort within VR, but it also makes those crucial first 30 minutes of an experience so much better. The application can hook you rather than asking you a bunch of questions. But there's more on standardization. I was pretty blown away when I first started developing on the Vision Pro. Apple has built an entire standard look and feel for every user interface for every app using SwiftUI. Now, the developers can go around that if they want to, but user feedback shows that this standardized UI implementation from operating system to application allows people to spend more time actually using the applications rather than menu diving and being frustrated. And I strongly believe that Meta or Valve or whichever big company needs to introduce an OS-themed style guide or user interface template, just like how every other platform does out there. 4, predictability of confirmation. Make navigation easy, satisfying, and predictable. Right now, almost every VR application uses raycasts or laser pointers from the controller, but they have some pretty massive flaws. Depth perception conflicts, shaky hands, weird controller tracking glitches that result in misclicks, and I think the most interesting is what's called the Heisenberg effect of spatial interaction. It's a phenomenon where you're pointing at something with the controller, and in order to interact with that thing, you pull the trigger. This causes a natural response where the wrist slightly pitches vertically, so you end up not actually hitting your target. Now, this is correctable after the fact, but it's rarely done by developers. And when it is done, everyone has their own way of doing it, meaning every application's laser just feels a whole lot different. And this could fall under standardization, but I believe the problem is not with standard lasers, it's with predictability. Even in Meta's core operating system, if I hover over a selection with hand tracking and pinch, the target location is moved because of the gesture, which is really frustrating and it's very unpredictable. Now, Apple, on the other hand, with the Vision Pro, uses an entirely different method for selection and confirmation. Instead of a laser shooting from your controller, the laser shoots from your eyes. You look at something and then pinch to interact with it. But that's not perfect either. In fact, the longer I use Vision Pro, the more frustrating it is when the eye tracking doesn't work perfectly. For example, a menu with two options: save this video recording or delete it. There's an internal panic unlike anything I've ever experienced before. Don't look at it, don't look at it, don't look at it. For tens of thousands of years, humans have used their eyes for information gathering, not for decision making. And I think we need a more predictable way of confirmation, whether that's reserving decision making to a separate swipe gesture, standardizing raycast, lerp, and Heisenberg confirmation, or introducing an entirely new control method like head gaze and gesture interaction. Taking the same core idea of Apple's eye tracking system, but instead of using your eyes for selection, you use an invisible laser shot from your headset. And I think with the correct signifiers and backend systems, you'd be able to interact with most things in VR without the downsides of the alternative. And 5, defining a VR OS conceptual model. Right now, I can't really tell you how the Quest OS or Steam VR flows. It's just a collection of menus that I navigate through because I kind of have to. I have no model for how these things are connected, and when I do at some point form some model, it ends up breaking because of an update that just rearranges the same thing. And this is the most exciting part of this entire guideline. Say what you want about the Apple Vision Pro, it's cool in some ways, it's very flawed in others, but there's one single thing that I think it does perfectly. Let me break it down. I want you to think of a desktop computer. Not today's computer, but instead one from 1977 with no graphical user interface. You have a single application with code exposed, and the interaction method is quite literally a command line. Think of this as the first dimension of human-computer interaction, a line. Now extend that line to the second dimension. Add a graphical user interface, a place to put multiple applications side by side, all fixed on a 2D plane. It's what we have today. This is your desktop, which holds all of your open applications, of which there are a few main types: widgets, windows, and some applications that full screen and take your entire desktop. This is a game or an immersive app. This is the second dimension of the computer-human interface. And this is exactly what the Vision Pro nails. Apple has what they call a shared space, and within that shared space, there are distinctly 3 types of applications: flat 2D panels that exist in 3D, volumes, which are 3D applications that just take up a certain user-defined volume, and of course you have your full screen games, your immersive applications that take over your entire shared space. And when you break it down, you realize that the shared space is just a desktop pulled out to the 3rd dimension, and it functions exactly that way. It's not a loose analogy, it's the same exact thing. And I think this is the biggest breakthrough that VR software has ever had. A strong conceptual model that is familiar in all the ways that we already interact with technology, but it amplifies them. And if you've ever operated a desktop computer, you'll intuitively know almost exactly how this works. And again, I don't think it's the eye tracking, and I don't think it's the lack of controllers. I think it's an intuitive, clear model that you don't need to think about because you've already been using it for your entire life.
Part 5. SIMULACRUM Inspiratio INTUITIVA.
So, it may seem a little ridiculous and perhaps unnecessary to go into the detail I did in this video, but I felt absolutely compelled to share some of the concepts that I learned while on this journey, and it's the kind of video that I wished existed. But I also went this deep because the world of design is legitimately so fascinating, and I think it's a really powerful feeling to leave the role of the everyone else and to see everything from just a slightly different perspective. And while terms like signifiers or affordances seem like such a mechanical way to think about the world, the funny part is that all of these design terms are really just philosophical concepts that try to explain and guide people to make things that people love. And as we build more and more complex things, we're adding little tiny bits to humanity's collective intuition. And beyond the technical jumbo, I found design to be a beautiful poem of analogies that are rooted deeply in our physical world. And these analogies allow us to navigate anything and anywhere. That is, as long as the design is good enough to guide our intuition. And speaking of intuition, throughout all of human history, intuition has actually been this mystical thing. It's like magic, and I'm not surprised. It's immediate knowledge, to know without knowing. And in Plato's Republic, to be touched by intuition is to be touched by the soul of eternity. To feel intuition about something is almost like filling a cup from the well of all of mankind's knowledge and to drink from it. And if you take a second to think about it, how do you really know something that you don't know? There are a lot of factors to it. Environment, designs, books, but there's something else out there, our gut. And that's what I find interesting about design. And that's what I find especially interesting about design in virtual reality. It's a kick-ass technology that we legitimately haven't figured out yet. No matter what anybody says, no matter the confidence in my words, nobody really knows anything. And the things we build today to please our intuition are the analogies and skeuomorphisms that will be used tomorrow. And it's not the alien science fiction of Johnny Mnemonic, and it's not the alien nature of today's interfaces. It's instead going to be built off of what humanity already knows. And that is exactly why I find VR so damn cool. But we can do better.
Don't be afraid to try new things, but definitely also refer to the things that have been done that are good. It is the Wild West, but we are paving roads and putting down foundations for the future.